Do we have volume? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Pedro Noguera. I'm the Dean at the Rossier School of Education, and welcome to our master class. This is the second semester of a product we launched last fall. The idea being we want to stimulate conversation among our students, faculty, and staff on issues of great importance to our field. In the fall, we focused on teaching and learning, pretty basic. This semester, we're focusing on science denial and racism denial. 2 weeks ago, Professor Gail Sinatra, who is also our Associate Dean for Research, launched us with the first class focused on science denial. She's also an author of a book by the same title. Today, we have Professor Shaun Harper, who, as you can see, is going to speak about racism denial. I don't have the benefit of the printed bio of the distinguished Professor Harper, but let me tell you, when you have time, go on to the website and you will see just how impressive he is. He is the Provost Professor of Education and Business. He has joint appointments between Marshall and Rossier. He is also the director of the Center on Race and Equity. Here, Race and Equity Center, I'm sorry, here on campus. He has a national and international reputation for his work. This is his second term at USC. Prior to coming to USC, he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been the president of the American Education Research Association. He was elected to the National Academy of Education in 2021. He is the author of numerous books, research articles. He is one of our stars at this university, and we are so proud to have him as a member of our faculty. So without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Shaun Harper. Thank you, sir.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dean Noguera, for your leadership and for that generous framing and introduction. I'm going to state the obvious. Our dean is a genius. Most of us knew that already. I don't say that to be gratuitous. This whole master class idea was his. He thought of it as a way to really democratize access to all of the faculty here who are doing really cutting edge work. Those of you who may not get a chance to take courses with us, he wanted this to be a cross-school community intellectual experience. I think that is really, 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 really smart. So thank you. He's also a genius because he gave Gail and me language. Professor Sinatra, as he mentioned, did a spectacular kickoff to this series 2 weeks ago. I'm really glad she went first. I'm going to derive my inspiration from her. But when Dean Noguera contacted Professor Sinatra and me, I thought, wow, I really, really like Gail and I really love her work. I wonder, though, what's the through line that will bring us together? We arrived at a meeting and he said, I want you to think about science denial and racism denial. And within a split second, it all made sense to me, right? Science denial is a term that Professor Sinatra uses certainly in her work, and it is familiar to us. Racism denial is not a term that I had previously used, but it's such a concise way to capture so much of what I and my colleagues at the USC Race and Equity Center work on every day in K-12 schools, higher ed institutions, businesses, governments, firms, and other organizations. So thank you. Just so you know, there are 3 more sessions remaining in this series. There's a QR code there that will take you to the website if you want to take a picture of that. But just quickly, in the first session, Professor Sinatra talked about what science denial is and where it comes from. I'm obviously talking about what racism denial is and where it comes from. The next time, we'll be together in conversation with Dean Noguera, and we'll be talking about the consequences of racism and science denial. So that will be here in the scriptorium on February 22nd. On March 8th, Professor Sinatra will come back and tell us what to do about it. And I will follow a couple weeks later in the same fashion. So please feel free to join us for the remaining sessions in the series. And for those of you who are joining virtually, thank you for being here. I'm going to stand right here in this spot so that I can be inclusive of our students and colleagues who are joining us online. All right, here's what we're going to do. I was incredibly, perhaps even dangerously ambitious when I put together the game plan for this 1 hour experience. I'm going to start by talking about racism in 4 forms. I think it's important for us to, before we talk about what we're denying, we probably should establish what it is, right? So I'll start with 2 of those forms. We'll take a break, and then I'll come back and I'll give you the other 2. We're going to talk about some inequities that, for me, are clearly incontestably attributable to racism. They are indeed racial inequities that I don't believe just simply manufactured themselves, but they are attributable to racism. I will define, for the first time ever, racism denial. I just told you that I didn't have language for, I don't know, like my whole body of work until Pedro gave it to me. So I've tried to operationalize that, and then we'll talk about where it comes from, why people deny the existence of racism, and then we'll conclude with, a reality with this national denial of racial realities in schools. And I don't know, there'll be a minute or 2 left for Q&A. Okay, I probably better go ahead and get us started. Racism in 2 forms. I'm going to just spoon feed for a second. I'll come back with the other 2 in a minute. Racism in 2 forms. The first is really familiar to us, right? It's individual, interpersonal racism. It's an individual's racist beliefs, assumptions, attitudes, and actions against and about other groups. I probably don't need to spend a lot of time here. Most of us recognize this particular, form of racism. Perhaps slightly less familiar to us is an understanding of systemic racism. Think of systemic racism as policies, practices, cultures, organizational norms, and histories and historical factors working in various, oftentimes reinforcing ways to manufacture harm and disparate impacts or effects on particular racial and ethnic groups. Think of systemic racism as a cascading, snowballing constellation of factors, right? So when I talk about racism denial, I'm not just talking about, individual people being racist, but I'm also talking about a sophisticated understanding of the sociocultural factors that, again, often work together in cascading and reinforcing ways. Look, it's early, but it's been a long day. I bet you probably could benefit from some comic relief. So why don't we take 2 minutes of our hour together to have me introduce you to an example of systemic racism in action. All right, here it goes.
Racism. You know, the problem that Crash failed to solve. And specifically, we're going to discuss school segregation, which it turns out is still a big problem.
Racial segregation is on the rise. The number of schools where 1% or less of the student population is white has more than doubled in the last 20 years.
That's true. Even as our society has grown more diverse, nearly 7,000 schools have the same racial makeup as the audience of your average Tyler Perry movie. And that one white guy is Leonard Maltin, and he has to be there. It's his job. Boo, a Medea Halloween, 3 stars. Now, At this point, if you're in a city like New York, you're probably thinking, oh, splendid. I know where this is going. A story vilifying the backwards and racist American South. Let me just grab a handful of kale chips that I can munch on while feeling superior. Well, hold on. There is something you should probably know.
According to the UCLA Civil Rights Project, the South is the least segregated region for black students. And in fact, New York State is now the most segregated system in America, in large part due to New York City.
Oh, shit, liberal white New Yorkers! Twist ending, you were racist the whole time! Put back those persimmons you bought yourselves as a treat from Fairway. You don't deserve them anymore. And look, it would still be problematic, even if these schools were roughly equivalent academically, as that would still be a violation of the principle of Brown versus Board of Education, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. But in practice, they are very rarely equal in any way. Black and Latino children are more likely to attend schools with inexperienced teachers, which are then less likely to offer a college prep curriculum. On top of which, because race and class are inextricably linked, those students are 6 times as likely to be in high-poverty schools. And while there are teachers and students working incredibly hard in those places, they are often doing so with fewer resources, as one student learned during a school exchange program.
Once a year, we do what's called a school swap, where students that go to county high schools attend a school in the city for one day, and then students in the city attend a school in the county for one day.
I went in, and the first thing that I noticed, actually, was all this stuff around here. I'm talking about stuff that looked like it costs lots of money. The teachers come in, they can get right on topic. They have multiple computers that they can use. And it's like, wow. And then I related back to my school, well, we don't have all that.
Okay, I get what that program was trying to do, but it still seems cruel, giving students a glimpse of what other kids are getting. At least on a plane, they cover first class with a curtain. And sure, they might still bake cookies and waft the smell down the aisle, but that's just to f*** with you.
Okay. I imagine some of you might be asking, but is it racist? Right? What does this have to do with racism? Before I answer that, let me just say that it's not just in the American South, it's not just in New York State, but also here in California. Last year, I did an analysis of every K-12 public school in the entire state of California, looking at student enrollment and more specifically, racial demographics. There are 3,806 schools in the state of California in which 70% or more of enrollments are comprised of students from one single racial group. And you can see the breakdown of that 3,806 schools, right? Look, this is not entirely explained by people not wanting their kids to go to school with other kids from different racial groups. That may be the case for some folks, to be sure, but there is a more systemic explanation. To also be sure, this isn't just everywhere else in California. It also happens here too, in LA specifically. Later this spring, our center is publishing a report on where Black students are and are not in Los Angeles public schools. I think the numbers will be shocking to you as we take stock of the hyper-segregation of public schools in our nation's second largest city, in our nation's second largest school district and other local school districts. So stay tuned for that. I'm gonna deliberately just leave that there as a cliffhanger. I won't preview any of those results here in the interest of time. But let's get back though to the racism of it all. Let's think about school segregation systemically. It is traceable back to land theft, to the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, to the enslavement of Africans here in the Americas. You see, indigenous people and enslaved Africans were not allowed to own land and property and amass generational wealth that could be passed on to future generations in their families. Then, okay, slavery ended, right? But segregation did not. Schools were still very much segregated. Under Plessy, they were supposed to be, Plessy versus Ferguson, they were supposed to be separate but equal. They were not equal from the start, right? And there continued to be enormous residential segregation because of Jim Crow. Then there's redlining, a practice that banks and financial institutions used to lock people of color out of particular neighborhoods. There literally were maps of cities around which banks drew red lines, and they did not give mortgages to people who lived in those red-lined areas. Those people were Black, brown, indigenous, and low-income Asian folks, right? So meanwhile, white people who were able to get mortgages, again, were able to amass generational wealth that could then be passed on to their children and to their children's children and so on. Because of redlining and centuries of residential segregation, right? Those areas where people of color are heavily concentrated tend to have lower property values and therefore lower property taxes. Those areas, by comparison, with higher property taxes, those taxes go to fund public schools that are more highly resourced. Then there are the food deserts, the shortages of business and commerce. Recently, City National Bank was sued and settled with the Biden administration. I believe it was $32 million. It's a $32 million settlement for their segregation practices, their redlining practices in 2022 here in LA. So I don't mean to speak of these things as if they ended, in the 1970s with the Fair Housing Act and, other legislative attempts. Just a couple weeks ago, City National Bank settled with the Biden administration for more than $32 million, right? So also in areas that have been neglected, there are high unemployment rates, high rates of poverty, high rates of crime, right? So, middle-class folks don't want to move to those places unless they're going to move there in droves and gentrify those places, right? Okay, so then here we are in thinking about sort of the segregated nature of schools, right? There have been inadequate reparations for the centuries of neglect and underinvestment, and there continues to be chronic underinvestment. So in other words, what I am saying to you is that hyper-segregated schools are not that way because Black, brown, indigenous, and Asian American folks don't want to go to school with other people. They don't want to go to more highly resourced schools, right? There is a systemic constellation of racist policy forces and practices and so on that help explain. Here's another example. For me, it's really clear that is because of racism. What you're looking at here is an infographic that was produced from a report that my PhD advisee and I did, in which we were looking at school suspension by race and ethnicity in 3,022 public schools across 13 southern states. Here's a recap of what we found.
For years, there has been mounting evidence that schools across the country suspend and expel Black students at a much higher rate than white students. Today, a study by the University of Pennsylvania singles out 13 southern states where the problem is worst. Here's NPR's Claudio Sanchez.
Schools in these states were responsible for more than half of all suspensions and expulsions of Black students nationwide.
Black kids, on the whole, are suspended for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with safety.
Sean Harper is with the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. He co-authored the report, which looked at a total of 3,022 school districts. In 132 of them, the suspension and expulsion rates of blacks were off the charts.
In those 132 districts, blacks were suspended at 5 times or higher their representation in the student body. There were 84 districts where blacks were 100% of the students suspended from public schools.
Now, Harper says most people presume that because these schools are in the South, they enroll more black kids than anywhere else, and that's why their expulsion and suspension rates are higher. Wrong, says Harper.
Blacks are only 24% of the students enrolled in public schools in those states. Yet, they are 48% of students suspended and 49% of students expelled.
Dean Nogueira's work and other people who've done work on school discipline inequities make clear that black and brown kids are not suspended at higher rates because they are worse, because their behaviors are worse relative to their white peers, right? There are systemic explanations for the over-identification and the targeting and racial profiling of these kids in schools. Look, let me give you the other two forms of racism. Let's talk about institutional racism. It's a little bit different from systemic racism, right? Again, systemic racism is about the constellation of forces. Institutional racism is the perpetuation of discrimination on the basis of race within political, economic, or legal institutions and organizations. So think within the context of a school district or a university, right, where these racist actions and policies and so on become institutionalized. It becomes a part of the way that the organization behaves and functions. Then there's cultural racism. It relies on cultural differences rather than on biology, biological markers of racial superiority or inferiority. There is no such thing, by the way. No racial group is born genetically inferior to another. Instead, these things become a part of our culture as a nation, as a school or school district, or as a university. Cultural racism also governs how people treat or mistreat others within a cultural context. It's the culture of the place. What do I mean? Well, a couple weeks ago, I wrote a piece for Forbes. It's about the murder of Tyre Nichols in Memphis. You could grab the article through the QR code, or you can go to uscrec.info/Memphis Cops to access it. You know, in it, I explain how even though Tyre Nichols was a black man and his murderers were also black men, all 5 of those cops were black men, that racism is still an explanatory factor, right? Because they were operating within the institutional norms of the Memphis Police Department and the law enforcement industry more broadly. And specifically, as we watched that video of how they fatally beat that guy, beat him to death, really, you know, that wasn't just evil. It was also cultural. It's part of the culture. It's the culture of what that particular special force was allowed to do, right? That is just one very terrifying example of how institutional and cultural racism commingle. Now, despite these examples, and I could go on and on and on and on, I could talk about the Black maternal health crisis. I could talk about a piece that I read in the New York Times last week that showed that Black folks are more likely to be audited by the IRS than our other racial groups. I could go on and on. I could talk about the deportation and separation of families and the racist policies and practices that lead to, you know, that kind of family separation. But despite there being so much evidence and so many examples all around us, there's still people who flat out deny that America has a racial problem. They deny that racism exists. So let me operationalize, a definition here for racism denial. This is my first draft, so don't quote me on this via social media. It is subject to change. But I'm thinking of it as a refusal to attribute racial inequities to racism, a disbelief in the lived experiences that people of color characterize as racism, revisionist racial histories, and deliberate exclusion of racial truths. This is what I think of as the companion to what Professor Sinatra characterized as science denial. I think of racism denial being this. How does it work, this racism denial? There's a brilliant sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He and his collaborator published this article that was based on a study they did. It was a set of surveys, attitudinal surveys with people across different racial and ethnic groups. They found that whites overwhelmingly attributed racial inequities to anything but racism. It's because people of color are lazy or unambitious, or because they grew up on the wrong side of town, without accounting for structural and systemic and institutional racism. Okay. Right? It was just all of these explanations that were attributed to anything but racism. It wasn't because, people with whom they were interacting or the architects and maintainers of the systems themselves were racist, or that the system itself was racist, right? So that's how it works. People convince themselves that it can't be because of racism. Well, where does that come from? That logic. Here's a front cover from Newsweek, now over a decade ago. As you can see, there's a very provocative question on the front cover: is your baby racist? The article that goes along with the article, or that goes along with the cover rather, synthesized lots of research from child development scholars, human development scholars, psychologists like Gail, and others. Those academics reached consensus that no one is born racist, but instead we're socialized to have problematic beliefs about the racial other. We're socialized in our families and communities. We're socialized in school. We're socialized by the media that we consume, right? That's where it comes from. It comes from, these multifaceted agents of socialization. Why do people deny? Why do they stay in this place, right? These are kids that this particular article and the studies that it was citing were talking about. But really, kids grow up to be adults who continue to be socialized in particular ways around race. So why do people deny that racism exists? Well, let's start here. Some people are racist, for the record. I just want to go on record, just acknowledging that is a thing, that continues to be a thing. Even though I'm a guy who mostly works on systemic racism, just want to acknowledge that interpersonal racism is still a thing, right? But then also, people only think of individual racism, right? They're like, well, I'm not racist, or at least I don't like to think of myself as racist. My colleagues are not racist. My friends are not racist. My parents and grandparents and family members are not racist, right? Because people have been conditioned to think of Ku Klux Klan style racism, and they don't think of their friends and family members, and certainly not themselves, as that. Many Americans, not just school children, but also others of us, including adults, many Americans don't interact with others whose experiences are different from their own. So when you don't have interaction with diverse others, and you're reading in the media, or those diverse others, you may hear them on the radio or some other place talking about racism, you just can't believe it. Why? Because you hadn't seen it for yourself. Why? Because you live in a racially homogeneous environment. All of your, or the overwhelming majority of your interaction is with people who look just like you. So therefore, it's harder to convince you of somebody else's lived experience and reality. Students in schools are not taught racial truths, nor are they taught to value racial evidence. We don't teach that. There's a whole coordinated attack on teaching a thing that ain't even being taught. I'm going to come back to that at the end. For some of us, we deny the existence of racism because, frankly, it is just too uncomfortable. It's too stressful for us to confront racial realities. USC Rasier professor Jessica DeCure Gunby she's one of Gail's colleagues at Psych. Professor DeCure Gunby is doing some really amazing and important work on the role of emotions in racial stress and in racialized interactions. So for many of us, we just deny, it's convenient for us to just deny that racism exists because otherwise doing so, acknowledging it, is just too stressful. We feel embarrassed. For those of you who are white, perhaps you feel some form of white guilt. And it's just easier to just pretend that it doesn't exist. Okay, here's one last one. Oh gosh, there's the confluence of racism or race and politics, especially during these times of very intense political polarization in the United States. That political polarization between Republicans and Democrats also ends up getting racialized in particular ways. And it compels one side of the folks who are involved in the conflict, I'm not going to say which side, to just deny that racism has anything to do with the inequities that we're seeing. It's because of everything else. It cannot be because of racism. Their party lacks, I didn't say which one, racial diversity, because it can't be because we're racist. It has to be because of these other things, right? It just, right? It's the Eduardo Bonilla Silva explanation that it's anything but racism. How is it learned? You see, my research shows that racism denial is learned. I'm very quickly going to tell you two ways how. So one of my most cited articles was published in the Review of Higher Education. In it, I did an analysis of every article that had been published over, I forgot the time span, but it was a pretty extensive period of time. Let's say a decade or 2 decades. I can't remember which one. But it was a lot of articles, like more than 300 of them, that were published in these journals. The articles and the studies themselves were about people of color. They were about racial climate on campuses, or they were otherwise about race, right? Race was treated as a variable in the overwhelming majority of these studies. And the researchers, who are my friends and colleagues, I don't call them out by name in the study, but they showed like all of these racial inequities that their analyses revealed. But when we got to the discussion section where folks were making sense of what their findings and results showed, they attributed those differences to anything but racism, right? Very, very, very rarely were the words racist or racism used as explanatory factors for the racial inequities that they had discovered in their research. What does this have to do with learning? Well, we assigned those articles in courses in graduate schools of education, right? Reading the ways in which scholars skirt around race and skirt around racism specifically, and like don't name it, has a socializing effect on say, PhD students who are preparing to become faculty members. If the stuff that you're reading isn't calling a thing, then you come to understand that the academic norms and expectations of your field are to not call a thing. You call it something else. You call it chilly climate. Listen, I've been doing climate work for 2 decades. Never once, not one time in the thousands of people that I've interviewed has any person characterized their racial climate on their campus or in their workplace as chilly. They call it racist. Or maybe racially hostile, but certainly not chilly, right? But, you know, those softer semantic alternatives are often used in the higher ed literature. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say also in the teacher ed literature. Professor Sinatra, would that also be true in the ed psych literature? Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay. All right. So this is one way that it's learned. Here's another. Let me talk with you quickly about one qualitative study. I could talk with you about lots of qualitative studies, but in the interest of time, there's just going to be one here. This particular qualitative study I conducted over 3 years. And I was interested in learning what students in schools of education, graduate students, so people like the ones that we prepare here at Russier, I wanted to understand what graduate students in schools of education were learning about race and racism, racist policies, so on and so forth. So in the first phase of the study, I did focus group interviews with 84 second-year master's students. By the way, I said these students were all in schools of education. More specifically, they were all in higher education and student affairs master's and doctoral programs. But as I laid this out for you, I want you to imagine, could the same thing be happening in teacher ed or ed leadership or ed policy programs or ed psych programs, right? Okay, so focus groups with 84 second-year master's students. Most higher ed master's programs are 2 years. Ours here is 1 year here at Russier, but most of them are 2 years. So, you know, these were students who were at the end of their master's degree journey. It was within 6 weeks of completing their master's degrees. In the second phase, I did individual interviews with 22 early career professionals. These were people who were graduates of those same 14 higher education programs. And they were within the first 5 years of their careers. The way that I found these 22, it wasn't random, wasn't arbitrary. There are 2 leading higher ed associations, particularly for student affairs professionals, NASPA and ACPA. Each of them give early career awards. These 22 early career practitioners were all recipients of those early career awards. So these were folks who were, you know, not just professionals, but they were seemingly exceptional professionals, the best, presumably, right? Okay, phase 3. I did individual interviews with 21 advanced PhD students in higher education PhD programs, again, from those same 14 universities. These were folks who were on the market for tenure track faculty jobs. And in phase 4 of the study, I did individual interviews with 11 tenure track assistant professors. These were folks who were either in year 4 or 5 on the tenure track. They were on the eve of going up for tenure. So they had been professors long enough to know what it's like to be a professor. Right, so the through line here is that I wanted to understand from master's students, what did you learn about racism in your master's degree programs? They said, well, Professor Harper, we learned in our student development class, theory class, that there are ethnic identity models for Asian Americans, and there's a different ethnic identity model, the cross model. Oh, do you mean cross 1971? Yes, that one. We learned that one, that for black people, that there's that. But, could you clarify what you mean by racism, though? I was like, you know, like when tiki torch carrying white nationalists show up at a university where you work, did you learn what to do? They're like, no, sir, we didn't talk about that at all. Did you learn what to do when you are a supervisor, say next year in your professional role, and somebody accuses you of being racist? How to manage your emotions, how to be thoughtful and self-reflective. Like, please, no, we didn't learn any of that. With the early career practitioners, I was like, all right, so you've been professionals working full-time for 5 years. Give me some examples of some racist things that have happened at your institution. Every one of those early career practitioners had examples, every one of them. And I said, okay, now think back to your master's degree program. What did you learn there about how to deal with the things that you just described? They're like, sir, no, we didn't know. Not at all. I was utterly unprepared. So too were my colleagues who are twice my age, who are in senior administration, right? The point here is that these early career folks didn't learn it, and presumably nor did the senior folks along the way. In the interest of time, I'll just tell you that the PhD students said, yep, we read those papers about racial inequities that showed racial inequities between and among groups, but we didn't learn like how to like actually teach about the undercurrents and how to think about in our analyses and in our actual teaching, to the future students who would be our students when we become faculty members, how to name racism and how to teach those folks that we're going to be teaching how to disrupt that racism, right? Look, the whole point here, I probably didn't do this study justice. I'm starting to get nervous. I want to leave time for some Q&A. But the point here, right, is that racism denial, we're all socialized to do it, even in graduate school and in our early careers. And we continue, even as social justice minded, equity minded, we're good people. Even we are conditioned to not talk about racism as explanatory, undercurrents for the racial inequities that we're seeing. All right, look.
In another
before I go there, I just talked about how it's learned, right, through the things that people read, certainly through the things that they talk about or don't talk about in courses and in their early careers. But let's talk about how it's not being learned. There's a coordinated attack on the teaching of critical race theory in K-12 schools and at public colleges and universities now across the country. I have maintained and I continue to maintain that critical race theory ain't being taught to fifth graders. I have very publicly, repeatedly called for a list of 50. Give me a list of 50 educators who are teaching critical race theory. I don't mean in one school or in one district. I mean nationally. I'll wait. Give me 50 teachers who are teaching critical race theory to K-12 students. It ain't happening, right? So let's now talk about how racism denial is playing itself out in state policy context across the country.
In another campaign-style press event,
Governor Ron DeSantis!
Florida's governor pushing a bill he says will block critical race theory in Florida schools and beyond.
No taxpayer dollars should be used to teach our kids to hate our country or to hate each other.
Similar to what Iowa passed this year, the Stop Woke Act codifies Florida's current ban on CRT curriculum for K-12 schools. Parents get the power to sue districts that don't comply. That's not all. The policy would defund CRT consultants for state schools, colleges, and universities. Plus, CRT employment training is also forbidden under threat of a lawsuit for creating a hostile work environment.
That's not the type of society that we want here in the state of Florida. We want people treated equally. We don't want ideology.
The governor's allies applauding the move as proactive protection against critical race theory.
CRT is just wrong. It's even more than that. It's an untruth. It's a lie.
Critics say it could lead to more costly and frivolous lawsuits, and many Democrats figure it's a bill about nothing. Ranking Democrat in the Ed Committee, Senator Chevron Jones, tweeting, "This notion by our leaders that children are being taught to hate their color, I call BS."
I haven't heard one parent complain about it.
Others, like Senator Lori Berman, say the act is little more than a political stunt.
Potentially for a run for higher office, because right now in Florida, critical race theory is not being taught in our schools.
Members, the House will come to order.
The legislature gets the bill next when session starts next month. There it will face a majority of friendly Republicans over the 60-day lawmaking gauntlet.
Here's a map from Education Week. Ed Week is tracking this in real time. What you're seeing here are states that have passed anti-CRT bills. Those are the ones in blue. The ones in red are states that attempted to pass legislation, but it failed or either got vetoed mostly by Democratic governors. In yellow, those are bills that have been introduced that are still active. They've not yet been acted on. They're still moving through the process. And I don't know, let's see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. There are only 8 of us where there have not been legislative attempts to ban teaching about race. This really isn't about teaching about critical race theory specifically. It is a coordinated attack on racism denial, or it's a coordinated denial of racism, right? It's a coordinated campaign to deny our school children the truth about America's racial past and present, right? So in our next masterclass, as I mentioned, Professor Sinatra and I will be in conversation with Dean Noguera, and we'll be talking about the consequences of said denial. At this time, we have 12 minutes left. I would love to answer any questions that you may have or hear any critiques, pushback, comments, feedback, whatever. 12 minutes, including our students and colleagues who are joining us virtually. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Let me know who's ready. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Mariama Nagby, postdoc in Pullius. I think about Chris Emdin's quote in a talk on Twitter, I want to say, where he's like, these CRT bans are weapons of mass distraction. And I'm thinking about, like, for those of us who know and are still getting swept up in the delusion of the denial, how do you resist that temptation when the precarity of the consequences, and perhaps this is a preview into the next conversation, but the consequences and sanctions around this denial have material realities that affect our livelihoods, but also us as educators have a responsibility for, as you were raising, socializing the next generations, the current generations, and reconciling the past that keeps getting denied. Like, how do you make sense of all of those complexities as an educator when the allure to debunk the denial can shift you from actually doing the work that continues to do the truth telling?
Yeah, love this. I'm going to answer in 2 ways. Thank you for going first. Professor Emdin and I are co-writing a book with Rasir Professor Royale Johnson. Harvard Education Press is publishing it, and it is about countering the attacks on truth teaching. We are writing this book for practitioners. We're not writing it to merely speak to other academicians. So in it, we are attempting to give colleagues who are engaged on the ground in schools, turn-by-turn guidance on when they say this, you counter it with this, right? So part of it is about amassing, evidence about what is and what ain't happening. But part of it is also giving practitioners, advice on how to not only respond as individuals, but how to also respond collectively. So that's one thing that we're doing. The book is due at the end of this month. Pray for us. There's another thing, though, that I am perhaps slightly more excited about. My best friend, Lori Patton Davis, is a professor at The Ohio State University. Lori and I have been designing this national campaign on truth teaching. Chris Emden will be involved, obviously, and several others. But Lori and I are the primary engineers of the campaign. So in it, we are developing campaign collateral like posters, buttons, guides for people to organize. Right? You know, those who are organizing the attacks on truth teaching, you know, the racism deniers, they are very well coordinated. Those of us who know better are not very well coordinated. So Lori and I are, you know, really like borrowing tactics from political campaigns to start a national campaign. You know, I have fantasies about teachers. That didn't sound right. That sounded very inappropriate. I often wonder, let's go with wonder. I often wonder what would happen if teachers went on strike over this as an act of citizenship and preservation of our democracy, right? There's this ridiculous thing happening in Florida right now where teachers have had to remove books from their classroom libraries because every book now in a school has to be reviewed and confirmed by a certified media specialist to ensure that it doesn't have any queer stuff in it, any race stuff in it. It's ridiculous. If we think about, and look, this is not an attack on librarians and on media specialists, but they tend to be white women, right? So there's like one white woman in the school who's supposed to read and certify thousands of books. It's incredibly subjective. I just think that at some point teachers have to rise up and say enough with the ridiculousness. But we're trying to develop tools and strategies and, you know, again, assets for them to do so in a coordinated fashion. Others? And let's be sure, are there any that have come in from students or colleagues who are joining virtually?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm curious about your thoughts about, do you think that there's a correlation between American nationalism and a push for individuals of Caucasian descent to deny their ethnicity and nationality and dealing with and embracing and acknowledging the trauma that many of individuals of Caucasian descent in America had experienced, racism, with the racism denial in an attempt to whitewash or revisionist history, American history, to take away and to deny atrocities and trauma that has occurred to individuals of not only African American or indigenous, but then also Caucasian descent.
Yeah, you know, listen, let me be a responsible social scientist here. Because I don't do correlational studies, I can't claim a correlation or causation here. What I will say, though, is that for many folks, the America that they know or what they have been taught is America. It's just so fundamentally inconsistent with what the rest of us are saying is also America, right? Like, I was watching Tucker Carlson. I hate myself sometimes, and these are I just torture myself. So I was watching Tucker, and he's a Fox News commentator, just a couple days ago, and he was talking about, you know, we need a defense of justice. Wait, what do you mean by that? Justice for who? right? Like he was suggesting that it's an injustice to be teaching these kinds of things. You know, we ought to be teaching freedom and liberty and justice for all. Do you mean all, right? Like, but it could be, here's what I'm going to give him a pass, potentially. It could be that Tucker is a byproduct of his own miseducation. Like the rest of us. When you've only been taught, especially if you went to a racially segregated, you asked me about white people. Okay, so if you went to a very white school and you're a white person and you've only been taught that America is this, you deny that America could even potentially be what this black woman is saying it is. She's got to be the one lying. It can't be that I was lied to. Okay, there are 3 minutes remaining.
There is an online question.
Yes.
It says, can you give 2 or 3 examples of retorts that you have used when people make bogus claims about CRT? Specifically retorts when you know they do not know one component or aspect of CRT.
Oh, this is great. I love this. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I ask people, you know, to give me 50, and I wait. Like I literally just I sit there and I wait. And they're like, I'll get back to you. None of them have ever gotten back to me, so there's that. Another is, I embarrassed this guy on the Dr. Phil show one time. Oh, it was so delicious. And he was like, he was like saying all this stuff about CRT. I was like, sir, tell me, who are the CRT writers that you've read? I'll wait. He was like, I can't, none of them come to mind right now. Yeah, because you hadn't read them. You only have listened to what Tucker Carlson has said about them. You haven't read them for yourself. So, you know, it's that. Like I ask people for evidence. One of the things that I didn't say, so I really appreciate this question. Thank you. When our center was at Penn, in our K-12 portfolio, we did an analysis of curriculum from kindergarten through 12th grade. All across the country. We collected curricula from different states. And we were attempting to map where students were learning about race. No, they were not, right? So I think one retort for me is, I got the receipts. I have evidence. Where is your evidence that this is actually occurring? As opposed to, you know, like this boogeyman that, you know, has been manufactured as a political football. All right, we got 2 more. There's an Alpha Phi Alpha member back here who has a question.
Why would you call me out like that?
You wore this shirt today. You clearly wanted us to know that you're an alpha.
Hello, my name is Izzy. I'm a first-year PASA student part-time. You talked about how the next generation of equity-minded practitioners are not well equipped to handle certain situations in terms of race. And personally, with my experience being here in PASA, I'm speaking personally for myself, I don't think that we have been very well equipped in terms of conversations coming to race, identity, and actually tackling those things in the real workforce. So I wanted to get your perspective on how personally, as a student and even the students that are here, how can we do the work inside of our own classrooms to make sure that we're well equipped to handle those situations and we're unlearning our own biases? Because I think right now we're learning the material, but I feel like we're not really deconstructing our own internal biases that we have inside of ourselves, and that could be harmful for the next generation coming into the classroom of higher education.
Izzy, it's Izzy, right?
Yes.
Izzy, how much y'all pay to go here?
It's like $60,000 a year.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, Izzy. I'm a huge proponent of important self work. I am, but y'all also pay $60-something thousand to go here, so it ought to be an educational expectation of yours that your professors better serve you and your classmates. Right? You've come here to learn how to do these things. It's a good thing that our dean is a recovering activist himself, because really, like most things, will be like, no, don't say that. But no, really, I feel very strongly that students ought to collectively, express your high expectation for being better prepared to lead on these things in 21st century racially, ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse organizations, especially at this price point. So I don't know, like, I don't have a lot of individual advice for what you all should be doing and taking on as students. I don't want to rob you of your agency. You have agency as individuals, but I don't know, like, you should expect that we do better by you in, you know, like, not having you all like leave here unprepared. All right, last question, Dean Noguera.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Dr. Harper. Looks like the Supreme Court may make racism denial the law of the land as they ban affirmative action in the next few months, which looks like, given the makeup, they're headed. That has broad implications, not just for universities, but hiring and many other things. So I know I don't want to ask you to solve everything, but just your thoughts on that pending case.
Yeah, I've thought about this quite deeply, actually. I think that, you know, leaders like you and I and others, right, it's going to be really important for us to ensure that there is not overreach and overinterpretation, misinterpretation of the impending Supreme Court ruling. You were at UCLA before you came here. You know the effects that the ban on Proposition 209 has had on Black student enrollment, most especially in the University of California system. Enrollment and representation is one thing, but teaching and learning and preparing, you know, the next generation of Americans is another. I am afraid that what we're going to see is what I've seen in the UCs and in some CSUs, to a much lesser effect in the California community colleges. But over the years, I've seen people in the UC say, oh no, we can't do this, we can't do that because of 209. Like, no. When you do an actual reading of 209, come on now, it doesn't say y'all can't do all these things. It says you cannot admit someone on the basis of their race, but it doesn't say that you can't do all of these other, you know, really important educational things. So I think it's gonna be on us to, you know, like, pull people's cards when they are attempting to, you know, say that we can't do anything in the name of race, including teaching people that racism is real, because the Supreme Court ruling said we can't use race as a variable in college admissions.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Well, hey, thank you for coming, and thanks for those of you who joined virtually. We look forward to seeing you back here in the Scriptorium on February 22nd at 4 o'clock for a fantastic conversation. Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.